Reverend Don. And this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically, beautiful Danville, Illinois. And thank you for joining me for Midday with Reverend Don. I very much enjoy this time spent with you every day. I hope you're enjoying it too. And as always, if you'd like to interact directly, you can use whatever platform you're watching on. Type your comments or questions into that platform. They'll appear in my chat room, and we will interact directly. And in the meantime, I will talk. And I have to say my sense of aesthetics just wishes this closet were a little more centered on the wall. Um, I may have to move the desk a little bit to center the image a little bit more, or maybe I'll put something over on the side. Um, we'll see how things develop. One of the nice things about being in a new home is that things will develop. Um, it and you'll get to watch because little by little we'll be acquiring pieces to expand what is here, to make the house more homey, and to improve both the functionality and the aesthetics of the office. And you'll watch as it happens. Just as you watched as the old office was disbanded, you'll watch as the new one is built. And already you've seen boxes moving in, boxes moving out. A lot of what was in the boxes is now in the closet, which is where a lot of shipping items are and so forth, um, and some art supplies. Because this is an office that fulfills a number of functions. There is filming, as we're doing now. There is shipping. There's artwork. So I do a lot of things here, and we'll be doing more. And I'll be talking to you about them as we do. I have a number of projects coming up, but one of the more interesting ones that you may have been following for a while is Library of Horror, returning to paganworld.tv. And of course, I believe the old Library of Horror has been airing right along, which are the several films that we did previously, but the new season is about to begin. And I believe the first one is to be on Saturday, June 24th. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too. And probably on Monday the 26th, we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the features of that particular movie. I think you'll find it enjoyable. The movie will be Metropolis. I would say if you're not familiar with Metropolis, but I can't imagine anyone is not familiar with Metropolis. It is considered one of the great milestones in cinema, which also happens to be in the public domain. So we can use it for Library of Horror. And, is it a horror film? It's usually thought of as a science fiction film, but in fact, it has distinct metaphysical elements. And in that sense, it falls under the heading of a horror film. It's also a futuristic dystopia. And in that sense, I think it can fall within our purview. But we had a lot of fun making this Library of Horror episode, and I hope you have a lot of fun watching it. Hello to Bradley in the chat room. Good to see you, Bradley. And Library of Horror from the start has been an interesting thing to do. As a child, I loved horror films. And in those days, it was mostly the famous horror films of the 30s and 40s that were playing in syndication. And most major television stations had their local horror host who would, on Friday or Saturday night usually, have the horror theater. And the one where I lived was Sammy Terry out of Indianapolis. I grew up with Sammy Terry and always quite enjoyed him. And like all of them, he was very campy. Started out with very low production values. Eventually, he had relatively high production values. I believe the last major horror host left is Sanu Stenguli, who is also a wonderful horror host and is portrayed by Rich Coase, and has been going for 50 years. Cemetery eventually went off the air, and in fact, the performer passed away, but I believe his son is still performing the character at horror conventions and the like. It was a very interesting character. And the story of how the character began is relevant, I think, to where we are technologically again now with internet broadcasting. In the early days of television, local stations had some difficulty finding what they were going to put on the air for 24-hour days, which is where the idea of syndication comes from. But one of the things that they were able to do was buy old films at low prices that they could then show. They would buy the license to broadcast. And horror films were some of the cheapest that could be gotten at that time. And so the local horror host became a really big thing. And the Indianapolis station, WTTW, if I remember correctly, had just purchased this number of horror films, but they had no one to do the horror host. So they called upon one of their regular staff. Might have, I don't think he was the weatherman, but he was someone who was doing a regular news feature. And he was game, and he said, "Okay, I'll do it." He got some Halloween makeup and a flashlight under his face, and that's how it started. Very simply, in a room with no light, and he punted, so to speak. He gave it his best shot, and it lasted for decades. And in a lot of ways, that's where we are again. One of the things I remember from that era is how creative those low-budget productions could be, which you don't necessarily see in big budget productions. For one thing, they're often not willing to take the chance to be equally creative. WTTW was very creative. In addition to Sammy Terry, they had Cowboy Bob, who did cartoons and entertainment in the afternoon, Miss Janie, who had kind of a romper room sort of program, and numerous others. In Chicago, we had Garfield Goose and many other very entertaining local programs, Bozo's Circus, that because of their low budget character and interaction with ordinary people had a charm and creativity that the bigger budget productions often don't. And I'm personally kind of delighted by the fact that we're back in a place where that can happen. I enjoy the fact that so many videos I see online have that homemade quality. I think for me it adds something, maybe it's nostalgia, but I think it's really the creativity that people can bring. And some of the shows that have developed out of this, well, I won't say they could never have happened in a big budget atmosphere, they would have been different. I watch a lot of food porn these days, and Tasting History with Max Miller is one of my favorites. Max Miller was a performer at Disney who, during the pandemic, had to find something else to do, and he found Tasting History to do, where he, I assume originally for fun, did historical recipes along with a little bit of actual history behind them. And it proved so popular that he left Disney to become the independent producer of this program. But I don't know if it could have made its way in a big budget production or if it would have been as interesting if it did. Another one I'm watching recently is the Best Ever Restaurant Review channel. And he goes to unusual places to review the food all over the world. And he specializes in reviewing street food and odd food. A recent episode, he was eating isopod in Thailand. And he compares isopods to cockroaches of the sea. But in the hands of an expert Japanese chef in Thailand, I think it was Thailand, possibly Vietnam, now that I think about it. But in the hands of this expert Japanese chef, they apparently were delicious. And he'd had them before and they were not, which does speak to the role of the skill of the preparer in the quality of what you get. And that's happened in his show before. He was doing street food in Some other country, I don't remember it now, but they had excellent fresh seafood, but the quality of the preparation, you would buy it at the market and take it to be prepared, and it varied widely. One place he found utterly inedible, another was excellent. So it's very interesting to see that sort of thing. Another one I've been following recently is called Jolly, hosted by Josh and Ollie, who are two British gentlemen who review all kinds of food, and their personality, their man-child personality, is half of the program. But the interesting foods they review are also a big part of the program. This is very, very interesting, and again, I can't see it in a big budget arena, and so I'm very happy that we're currently in a place where such things can come forward. I also watch a lot of miniaturists who I can't imagine would ever have found a big budget platform, but I quite enjoy watching them on YouTube. For example, is Marina at Papa Atelier, uh, Toya at My Froggy Stuff, and they are doll customizers. Who would ever have expected that on a big budget production? But on YouTube, there are a lot of them, and it's fascinating to watch. And as a visual artist, I've learned a lot from watching it. I do work with puppetry, and I've learned a lot about how to prepare those puppets by watching doll customizers. But also, I have a history of painting sculpture and also creating sculpture. But watching these programs, I've learned techniques I would never have thought of, like using soft pastels for shading, um, and how to do that effectively and with permanence, which would have been my worry about it in the past. Um, but I would never have even thought of it. And so it's wonderful to have these resources that we have today that I certainly did not have in my youth. I know there are some people who love to bemoan the changes in the world. I'm not one of them. I think we've had wonderful changes. And I wish I'd had access to the kind of things that young people have access to today. I would have loved it. And, I've remarked before, and I probably will again, that there's a meme that was going around the pagan world for a while about how back in the day people would have been so disgusted to think that quote Becky could get her sage at Whole Foods, I think is the example they use. But what that meme actually proves is that people passing it weren't there back in the day, because the truth of the matter is we'd have been delighted to be able to get magical supplies that easily, and as easily as people can today. They weren't as hard as you might think to get, but they were a lot harder than now, and we would have been delighted. Right now in Danville, there are 3 metaphysical shops, or I guess 2 metaphysical shops and one that is popular with metaphysical people. When I was a child, there were none. Um, but you could certainly get metaphysical materials here. Some of my most interesting earliest books dealing with things like Wicca and ceremonial magic, I bought right here in town because you could. But then Danville has a long metaphysical history. Um, but an actual shop we certainly did not have. Um, and it's wonderful to have that kind of access. Um, and anyone who thinks that it was better without it must not have lived through those times. Um, and I think that's true of a lot of things where you hear people saying, "Oh, it's so bad now. It was so good then." I think they don't really remember them very well. There are some exceptions, um, but the truth is, so much is better now. And Bradley says, the more access to knowledge and resources, the better. And that's exactly how I feel. And, I had the great honor of knowing the Honorable Robertson, one of the founders of the Fellowship of Isis, and she constantly spoke about this subject. And hello to Mary in the chat room. Good to see you, Mary. And Lady Olivia would talk about how she hated to hear people talk about the good old days, because she was old enough to remember the good old days, and they weren't that good. And they were good for a few people, most people were desperately poor at that time. And she would talk about how when she was a child, the majority of the population were going around in what she referred to as ass carts, meaning carts driven by donkeys. While people from her social class had automobiles. And she thought it was much better that ordinary people could have good lives now, which they could not have had in the same way then. Now, of course, um, we're talking about physical prosperity, not emotional happiness. You can always find emotional happiness. Um, it's not dependent on physical things, but in terms of the quality of housing, the availability of services, the availability of knowledge, they've all improved tremendously. And she was very adamant that we must not think otherwise. And I totally agree. And Bradley says, we like to look back with nostalgia and rosy-colored glasses sometimes. And this is exactly what happens. And having studied history my whole life, I can tell you that there's nothing modern about that tendency. You can go back and find people in the Renaissance talking about how horrified they are by modern developments. You can find people in Greece and Rome talking about how horrified they are by modern developments. In fact, O tempus o mores um, is one of the most famous Latin sayings, which basically is that, oh, the times, oh, the practices. Um, and the implied it was so much better before. But that doesn't hold up if you actually look at Roman history. The Roman Republic was actually no bargain for ordinary people. And, that you'll read about certain horrible emperors like Nero. But one of the things that's made very clear by his contemporaries is that ordinary people were quite happy during Nero's reign and very sad to see him go. It was the senatorial class that did not have a good time of it. And both Nero and Caligula were hugely bad-mouthed by Roman historians. There's some evidence to suggest that isn't necessarily entirely true, and that it was to some extent an attempt to blacken their reputation after they were removed, and that the real reason they were removed has more to do with moving against the senatorial class on behalf of everyday people. Which, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Um, and, that's both sad, and on the other hand, it's human nature. And, I've talked about shadow work a lot. And that as you work with shadow work, at a certain point, you find you're dealing with universal issues. And in the end, human nature is part of all of us, and we all have to change it. And we can change it from any starting point. We just have to be willing to do so. Not overnight, and maybe not in our own lifetimes. But if you look at the world, I think we can say that many things have drastically improved. And one of the things I often find myself addressing is the issue of good versus evil. And as you probably know if you follow my work, I reject the word evil in the way it's commonly used. Now, as an adjective to describe something very bad, I use it occasionally. But as an existential concept, it's nonsense, in my opinion. Not that there's nothing bad that happens, but the idea of evil as sold has one, and good for that matter, has one major flaw. And that flaw is, what is it? What is existentially good? What is existentially evil? Humanity cannot agree on that subject. Some years ago, radical Christians were making an issue out of situational ethics and the idea that what is good or bad never changes. But you need only look at their own history to see that's not true. It wasn't that long ago that people thought slavery was a good institution, at least those people benefiting from it. And now most people would agree it was a terrible, terrible thing. It wasn't that long ago that people, again, the people benefiting from it, but also some of the people oppressed by it thought misogyny and the oppression of women was a wonderful thing and thought that the idea of equality between men and women was terrible. Now, most people would agree that that it's a good thing. Um, there are 1,000 other things. The way we treat children has drastically changed. The idea of um, of gentle parenting, for want of a better word for it, as opposed to physically abusive parenting, a few generations ago would have been considered a bad thing. A lot of people believed in that not only physical discipline, but a lot of it was a good thing. That point of view has drastically changed. So if we talk about the universe, where are these standards supposed to be? They aren't there. They're certainly not reflected in our world. Now, there may be an existential good and an existential bad, but there's nothing that's reflected in our community. Because, if we apply the views that most people would agree to being good and bad today to history, most of historical society is pretty bad. Only very small portions would measure up as good by most of our standards today, and we would be bad by theirs. So I think we have to be very careful how we look at these things. And Bradley says it's very subjective. And yes, Bradley is correct. The other thing, Bradley had remarked on nostalgia, and there have been studies done. This Redwood was remarking to me the other day that studies have shown that most people think the world was at its best place when they were basically just heading into adolescence. And of course, the reason is that most people had relatively carefree lives at that point. And it isn't that society was any better, they just didn't see the bad parts. And I think that's very true. I think one of the reasons people are so nostalgic is that for the most part, they were insulated as children from the problems of the world, and therefore aren't really aware that they were just as bad as they ever were or worse. Of course, that's not everyone, but I think for a lot of people it's the case. I remember when I was a child, everyone was nostalgic about the 50s. Um, but you go back and in the 60s, they were nostalgic about the 20s. In the 40s, they were nostalgic about the Edwardian era. And what does this have in common? Well, lots of people who were children during those eras were adults during the ones that were nostalgic about them. And I think that answers to a lot of nostalgia. And the truth is, there are always problems. They're not always the same problems, though a lot of them tend to be. Certain things about life are kind of given, including the presence of difficult people. Social issues, of course, do change and evolve. Sometimes, however, they come back, even when we think we've solved them. Um, but nostalgia for the past can be a decidedly two-edged sword, particularly if it's causing you not to look at the problems that were there. And I think the truth is that we must always regard that the place we are now is the best place, if only because we can still go forward. And I have to say, one of my favorite cards in the Tarot is the Fool, because how I read the Fool is that moment when all things are possible. It's probably because nothing has been done, but that's every moment. It's the chaos moment. The chaos moment is the moment when all patterns can be disrupted and changed, and that truly is every moment. But when we take that moment, we can create the next thing that we want. And I think that is always the best moment, which means the best moment is always now. We forget it, we don't always see it, but I think it's always true. And speaking of now, I want to take this now moment to say a few words about my Patreon. And as you know, I've been doing Patreon, and I have a number of tiers on Patreon that include things like my weekly chat room on Monday nights, which has been running since 1998. Now it's on Patreon. I'm doing a monthly newsletter. The first one will be coming out sometime in the next few days. I am doing a monthly seminar. The first will be on Saturday the 24th. in the afternoon. I'm doing a monthly mystery surprise, and when that one will come remains a mystery. But sometime in the month of June, there will be a special offering for that tier on Patreon that will be different from any other month. So lots of different things happening on my Patreon. If you would like to join my Patreon, I would greatly appreciate it. And you can find it at revdonlewis.com. I'm also doing readings again. In fact, I have a reading later this afternoon. If you'd like to get a reading with me, you can email me at donlewishp@aol.com or instant message me through Facebook or through Instagram, for that matter. And we can set something up. I've been reading for many, many, many years. And and Mary says, I will share the link again on my Facebook also. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. And I'm happy to be getting back into readings. I'm not expecting to get back into the psychic fair circuits, although you never know. But looking back, that was a lot of fun for a long time, but eventually exhausting. But then, there were points where I would go in and be busy from the time I arrived to the time I left. There are points I'd go in and sit there all day. And that's the nature of a psychic fair. No matter who you are, unless you're absolutely the most popular person there, it's unpredictable what you're going to get. And the worst part of it is hurry up and wait, which sometimes happens. Not bad in the short term, but in the long term, it became tiring. But as a private reader, I quite enjoy that, and I hope you'll consider getting a reading. And of course, also, we're busy at work at Corellian Publishing, at CorellianPublishing.com. Our most recent offering is the multilingual edition of The Five Mystic Secrets, and you can get it as a single volume in 8 languages. The Five Mystic Secrets is, of course, one of the most important writings in the Corellian tradition, and we offer it in this book in its original English, also in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Greek, in French, in German, in Swedish, and in Dutch. And I believe those are the languages. And we'd love to bring it to you in the future in more languages. Because the Corellian family speaks many languages and comes from all over the world. And we love you all. And with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour, and I want to say that I love you all. I'm so happy that you're joining me for this time of day. And we have lovely conversations, and I love it when we interact. And I hope that you find my commentary interesting and useful. And with that, let us have our prayer. And I will look forward to seeing you on Monday. However, I will remind you, I am having my 60th birthday celebration on Sunday. And hopefully you may come through there. It'll be good to see you if you do. And now for our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all of the wonderful things in our lives and for the role that you play in our lives. And we thank you for playing that role, for being with us in this journey. And we hope that you will help us to remain mindful of the fact that you are there, that we are never alone, that we always go forward hand in hand with the divine and with the beloved ones in spirit. And we thank you now and always, and knowing you are always with us, yet from respect, we thank you for your presence. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I love you all. I love spending this time with you. May you be blessed now